Adam, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is a pleasure. It's an honor. I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
I suspect some of my listeners will know who you are, while others may not. And so before we dive into your latest book, it'd be wonderful if you could share a little bit about your background. And you have a fascinating background, by the way. You've worked on some very interesting things. And so it would be useful to just get a picture of that. So if you could start by talking about who you are and what you do, the types of things you've done over your career, I think that would be, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. It reminds me of that movie. What's that scene in Analyze This where Billy Crystal is asked, "Who are you? Who am I?" Anyhow, it's I like watching movies. So yes, so I'm Adam Kahane. I'm originally from Montreal. I've lived all over the world. I'm back in Montreal. I have my educational background is entirely inappropriate for the work I do, which is a degree in physics and in economics. And I used to work in the corporate sector through my 20s. And the big hinge in my life is in 1991, when I was 30, I got involved in facilitating a conversation in South Africa about what could happen in that country. 1991 was a year after Nelson Mandela was released from prison and 3 years before the first democratic elections where he was elected president. And you cast your mind back, actually. It was a period of great turmoil. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Most people thought it was going to end badly. And I was asked through a strange coincidence to facilitate a meeting which ended up, or a series of meetings which ended up involving 28 South African leaders, black and white, left and right, opposition and establishment, politicians, business people, trade union leaders, academics, community leaders. And that just blew my mind, a whole other way of working on things I'd never heard of, let alone done, and that it is possible when faced with a very complex and conflictual situation, which South Africa was, and which many things are, including these days, that it's possible for people to work together to deal with it, including people that don't agree with or like or trust each other. So I ended up quitting my corporate job and immigrating to South Africa and starting to do that kind of work. I consider it my vocation, what I've done for 30 plus years. In South Africa, elsewhere in Africa, Europe, Asia, North America, Central America, South America, pretty well everywhere. More than 50 countries, always this same approach, which is leaders from across the system in question, with very different opinions and positions and bases of power, but working together. So that's what I've done. And in my spare time, I've written 6 books about what I've learned from doing that work. And this one you alluded to is my most recent.
Could you talk a little bit more about that hinge moment? Because I think would be really interesting. You were working for Shell at the time, right? Or just before that, in the scenarios team. So this is the world famous Shell's scenario team. And when you described I think a part of your book where you went and did this work in South Africa and you were not trusted initially because you're, I guess, coming from a international or a multinational, and just wondering if you could dive into that a little bit more. I think it'd be interesting.
Yeah. So yes, I was working for Shell at the head office in London in a department called Group Planning, which was, as you say, responsible for this very particular approach to doing strategic planning, which has as part of it telling stories about possible futures, what could happen, given that we can't predict what will happen, we can't control what will happen, what's possible. And I was at the time the head of global political, economic, social, environmental scenarios. And it happens that this shell method was well known in South Africa because several large South African companies had used it. And there have been several big South African corporate-led scenario exercises. So when the team that I ended up working with, which was initiated by two academics at a left-wing African National Congress aligned historically Black university, wanted to do what was originally called an alternative scenario planning exercise of the left, they also wanted somebody who knew this shell method, and they asked Shell to send a facilitator. And as I was the youngest and most expendable member of the department, I was sent. And yes, I think there's two reasons. Well, I think people didn't know what to make of me, partly because I was from Shell. At the very first meeting, I remember being introduced by a man named Trevor Manuel, who at the time was the head of the ANC's Department of Economic Policy. We can talk about him later because many years later was the inspiration for this book. But I think he introduced me with a smile as a representative of international capital. Alas, I no longer get introduced as a representative of international capital. But yes, but I think that wasn't the primary reason people didn't know what to make of me. It's that somebody said to me later, Adam, when we first met you, we couldn't believe somebody could be so ignorant about the situation in South Africa. We were certain you were trying to manipulate us. And when we realized you actually didn't know anything, we trusted you. So I think the more fundamental point is that in such situations, a typical way to enter is, I know about your situation. Here's what I think you ought to do. Let me try to convince you of it. And that would have been my typical approach. I was then and still am in a attenuated way, a bit of a know-it-all. But for several reasons, I wasn't at that moment. Partly because I didn't know much about South Africa and I had been busy with other shell things. And also because the little I knew of these people, I was really in awe of them. They're people who were, had in one way or another devoted their lives to making South Africa a better place. And so atypically for me, I arrived not knowing, with a low level of knowing and a high level of respect, which of course turns out to be the perfect formula for being a facilitator, and rather than a manipulator. And so that's, I think, at least from my side, I mean, many things contributed to the exercise producing what it produced, but from my side, I hit exactly the right note, which doesn't mean I've hit that note every time since. I've forgotten it many times, but that taught me something very important about what does it take to be helpful. And I think the main thing it takes is to be authentically trying to help rather than sell or manipulate or sell or something else.
Right. Yeah. Low level of knowing and high level of respect. I really like that. There's something very powerful in that statement. Because I think we do often see people, and we do it ourselves, want to charge in and, I don't know, fix a problem. Maybe we can get into some of the things in the book that we live in this world. And let's talk a little bit about two things. One is systems, and the other one is what you call radical engagement and what you mean by those things. But when we think about things, problems, right? We're increasingly in a lot of the naughty things KNOOTY, things that we're dealing with, the sort of complex things that we're often dealing with. It's almost an instinct to want to just isolate a problem and then solve for it without really understanding that it's interconnected with so many other things. And the fact that maybe you're having a discussion with someone else it means that, of course, they've thought about all of these things as well. And so there is no simple solution often for things that are really tricky, wicked problems, or however those things are described. And so I really like that approach to facilitation around just not knowing and wanting to help. So I'm just wondering if we could take a step back, though. When you just two things that really so systems. I've had people talk about systems thinking is a thing, but this concept of radical engagement. What does that mean? What is the?
Well, let me take both of them or all three of the things you've mentioned. So, my boss at Shell was a man named Kees van der Heijden, and I learned a lot from him about this work. So I consider him in a way my root teacher. But he used to tell me, Adam, the things we're dealing with are not problems that have solutions. They're problematic situations that we have to work with. And by problematic situations, it's a mouthful, but it means a situation which is problematic for different people for different reasons. And so that's already important. I called my first book, or the title of my first book is Solving Tough Problems, but it's not an accurate title because they aren't problems and they can't be solved. But I use that title because because I know that's how most people think about these things, and that's the purpose of a title, is to connect to what people are thinking about. But yes, so I have on my probably the largest set of books I have on my bookshelf that I've never managed to read are books about systems thinking. So it's an old idea and one that's pretty inaccessible, even though I've been moving around it for decades. And so one of the things I enjoyed about writing this book was being able to go back and trying to say, what's the essence of what a system is and what it means to work with the system. And it's actually a very short part of the book. It's only a page, but I'm very happy with it because I succeeded in doing just that. And so I took the classic definition by one of the early and most excellent popularizers of systems thinking, a woman named Donella Meadows. And in her book, she says, a system is a set of elements that are related in a structure that produces a characteristic set of behaviors that we can call a purpose or a function. There's lots of systems, and they don't have, solid lines around them.
Right.
There's energy systems, there's political systems, there's food systems, there's organizational systems. I suppose there's the system of the two of us producing this podcast, a set of elements, you, me, the technology, the internet, related in a structure, pretty simple structure of an interview plus all the associated electronics, and it has a function or purpose, which is to produce the podcast. So that's a simple example, but the key point is that, it has to do with the structure or the interrelationship among these elements. And usually you can't change a system just by swapping out an element, just replacing a person. It has to do with how the things are related. And just to go on a little bit, because I think it's important, one of the more people who's written more recently, and I think in a very complicated but helpful way about systems, is David Snowden. I think, if I remember correctly, you've
been on the show,
on this show. Brilliant guy. And he makes the point that systems provide constraints. They enable us to do some things and not other things. We can't have a wrestling match in this particular podcast system. It doesn't allow for that. But it also provides affordances. It affords us, for example, the capacity to have this conversation, even though we're sitting in different cities. And to go on, this stuff's simple but crucial, that systems work well for some people and badly for others. And this fact is obvious to some people and not obvious to others. That the systems have been built and can be rebuilt. They're not, that this is something that turns out to be one of the things about the book that I think is most important. Is we're used to thinking of systems as solid, smooth, stable, stuck things that take enormous effort to be changed, but they're not. They're fluid and changeable things. And I've been saying or thinking the last few months that one of the gifts of the present era, there's many non-gifts of the present era, but one of the gifts of the present era is it's perfectly obvious now that systems are changeable or are changing them. And then finally, they can be changed or transformed violently or peacefully. There's a lot of systems changing going on through bullying and bombing. So that's the frame for the book. And the frame for the book is how can we, each and every one of us, contribute to transforming systems peacefully. I don't think it says that in the book, but that's what I've come to realize is the point of the book. And then skipping ahead to the final question you asked, my answer is it goes in a roundabout way to get there, these 7 habits, which we can come back to later. But what I realized in talking about the book these last few months is probably the most important idea in the book is what's underneath these 7 habits, the foundation for them, and I call that radical engagement. I love writing. That's why I do so much of it. And one fun part of writing is getting to look things up in the dictionary. And sometimes it doesn't help and sometimes it does, but it really helped here because engaging means taking part in, pledging oneself to, holding fast, entering into conflict with. It's got all the elements I thought it ought to have in the dictionary. And when I talk about engaging, I'm not talking about doing it superficially, like I have a dinner engagement, but radically. And the word radically means not extreme, but it comes from the Latin root. So it means at the root or foundational, inherent, essential, fundamental. So the big idea in the book, or the most basic idea in the book, the underlying idea in the book, is what does it take to engage with a system radically, not distracted, resigned, knowing it all, hierarchically, at arm's length, with arms crossed, superficially, impatiently saying, take it or leave it. Not this, but rather this. Engaging alertly with hope and curiosity, horizontally, leaning forward, hands-on, digging deep, persisting, and above all, relationally and reciprocally. So that's the underlying stance. I think that's the fundamental answer I give to the question, how can we contribute to transforming systems fundamentally and peacefully? It's through doing that, or through that stance.
That is a great answer. There's so much there. There's so much to it. But one of the things that struck me, and if you maybe just talk a little bit about the origins of the book, but also just this word habit. And I really like that word. I was just thinking about it in reading your book. Actually, I was listening to it. I've got the audio version. I was listening to it. And it just struck me that that's a great word, because rather than, as you say, top down, hierarchical, let's sort everything out, let's do this sort of analysis of the system and everything. Habits are things, that you and I can do, and it just makes system change feel more transformational, more we all have a bit of agency. And not top down. And I'm just wondering if was that deliberate? I mean, that's the impression I got from reading the book, but that's it, that I'm just wondering why you landed on, there's 7 habits of highly effective people. There's this
Yeah.
those, but I really like that word habit.
Yeah. Well, yes, that is the point. But I think it's useful to elaborate a little bit. So transforming systems is always, or practically always, a collective activity that takes many actions by many people.
Right.
So I'm not saying one person.
Right.
There's not many cases where one person can change a system unless it's something trivially simple. And
which also goes to the top-down point, right?
Yes.
That we can't wait for leaders or someone does some great analysis and all of a sudden we have the solution.
Yeah. So I guess there's a few points I'm trying to make. One is, yes, it's a collective activity, but it still begs the question, what can each of us do every day? Not once every 4 years, not in some big strategy exercise, but literally every day. And secondly, it is possible to transform systems from the top down violently. And there's lots of people trying to do that. This isn't a book about that. I'm not saying that's never possible or never a good idea, but that's not what this book's about. This book is about how to. Somebody said to me, a word I'd not thought of in connection to the book, he said, this is about democratic systems transformation. And I think that's correct. But the other thing about the word habit, there are other words I could have used, practice, but I wanted to suggest something that we could learn and do every day, or that many people already are doing every day. All the people I interviewed are people. I didn't invent these habits. I discovered them from talking to people. But I guess the not obvious thing about these 7 habits is there are actually 7 habits for breaking habits. There's 7 habits for coming fresh to a situation. That's that's not an obvious connotation of the word habit, and I think we'll probably come back to this several ways, but it's all different from how to change things through imposing by force from the top down. It's on the contrary from engaging, and that's why it doesn't say, the word isn't directing or forcing, it's engaging.
Okay.
And not superficially, but under the surface, which is what radically means.
Okay. Could we canter through the 7 and maybe we can dive into a couple?
Yeah. So maybe just a word about how I got started in this, if that's
okay. Please,
if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because it explains a little bit where this material came from, and that I didn't just sit there and think it up. 4 years ago, when I launched my previous book, which is called Facilitating Breakthrough, I did 3 live online interviews with 3 people who, loosely speaking, could be considered great facilitators. Anyhow, people I knew a little bit and whose work I admired. Trevor Manuel, who is this fellow I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, who had been the head of the economics department of the African National Congress, and then when Mandela was elected, became the first Black governor of the Reserve Bank, and then the I'm getting mixed up. The first Black Minister of Finance in South Africa, a position he held for 13 years, making him the longest serving finance minister in the world. And then went on to start the National Planning Commission and is now the chairman of insurance companies. So somebody who has been involved in the transformation of South Africa, incomplete and imperfect though it is, for a long time, as an activist in the country, as a member of the so-called United Democratic Front, as a ANC executive, as a minister in the government, and now as a businessman. And I interviewed him for half an hour about how he had done that. And it was actually a terrible interview, because I had this idea of how these things happen. And when I asked him how he thought or how he described what he had done, it bore no resemblance to what I was thinking. And I very idiotically kept interrupting him to say, "Don't you mean this? Don't you mean that?" Anyhow, it's a half-hour interview. When it ended, I got these messages immediately from my colleagues and my wife saying, "Terrible interview. Don't quit your day job." Okay. Which was embarrassing, but also confusing because I didn't understand what I was missing here. And so I spent a long time going through the transcript, and I realized that Trevor's idea about how to contribute to system transformation as somebody in the middle of it, protagonist and activist, was completely different from mine as a theorist and facilitator, and in this case, a foreigner. To make a long story short, the core idea he was trying to get me to understand, which I wasn't getting, was it involved talking to people, but a lot. And at one time in the interview, he said, in the morning, we would meet with a group of business leaders in an affluent area, and in the afternoon at a university camp with some radical students, and in the evening in a poor community. Then at night, we'd work with groupings in the African National Congress. So this idea that in practice, what you do is engage over and over and over with people in different parts of the system. That's where the idea of radical engagement came from. So I realized that from this interview that there's something very important I didn't understand that I needed to, and maybe it'd be useful to other people. So the point I'm making is that the book arose not out of my own experience, or not primarily out of my own experience, but by talking to people. After him, I talked to Christiana Figueres, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that produced the Paris Accord, and then with Juan Manuel Santos, who had been the president of Colombia, who got the Nobel Peace Prize for signing the peace with the FARC, and then tens of other people, and eventually hundreds of other people. And through that process, making lists of habits and over and over and over, through iteration, came up with what's in the book. So I'm happy with what's in the book. And then realizing at the end, the underlying theme of all seven, which we can now go into, is this idea of a particular way of being with the system, or way of being with others in the system, that I refer to as radical engagement. So it was very much a discovery process. It's not straightforward to come up with a list of 7 things that is fresh and correct and useful. But I think through this big collective activity, there were eventually 300 of us working on the book on Zoom calls and in Google Docs. I think we came up with something pretty good.
Great. Could we talk about what the 7 things are? And there are a couple in particular that I'd love to spend a bit of time on, but
okay.
Could you perhaps, I don't know the best, how you prefer to do it? We could.
Why don't you tell me the ones you'd want to spend time on? I'll mention all 7, but I'll say more about those.
Sure. Well, the one that really intrigues me is this idea of working with cracks. So working with cracks in a system. And I'll also link it to another podcast episode. I had an author on the show. His name's Dan Davies. He wrote a book called The Unaccountability Machine. And it is based on the work of Stafford Beer, who was another systems thinker. And it was fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating, but also depressing. And the reason why I felt it was depressing is because it basically, he talks about how big organizations have built what he calls accountability sinks. And that means that these are processes or parts of the system. I'm probably butchering this a little bit, but that in which people don't take accountability for decisions. So we defer decisions to processes, policies, algorithms, and he then talks about our system of capitalism and this sort of this optimization of a single metric in organizations for shareholder value. And when you do that, you create you don't allow for a variance. I think it's variance or variability engineering. So the system doesn't adjust. So it's sort of like saying, you in a, say an organization has lots of rules, and so if the rule's working, then things are fine. But if not, you get lots of exceptions, and that should be an indicator that like something's off and we need to change something. But that isn't happening. And I just came away fascinated. It explains a lot, but then it made me feel rather depressed because it felt, how do we change this, right?
Yeah.
And so then I, read your book, Working with Cracks in a System. These are the points at which you can transform something that isn't working. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea.
Okay.
So I'd love to spend a bit of time on that one. Okay.
Well, thanks for that. And I'm very interested in listening to that podcast. And I'll go. Let me go through them quick. Let me go through them briefly, and then come back to that one. Mm-hmm. But I also want to come back to another one, which I think is even more related to what you're talking about, which is number one, acting responsibly.
Okay.
So the 7 habits, and I'm going to say them as they are and say what they're not, which might enable people to grasp them directly. And the book's very simple. It's an introduction, 7 chapters, a conclusion. So it's a pretty simple book in that sense. But habit 1 is acting responsibly, which doesn't mean doing just what's expected of us or whatever we like to do. Number 2 is called relating in 3 dimensions. It's probably the hardest chapter, but it says that it's crucial to understand, and this is very much the system's perspective, that other people are actors in the larger whole. They are wholes in themselves, and they are wholes in relation to one another. That's exactly the 3 parts of the Donella Meadows definition, but that most of us only deal with others in 1 or 2 of those ways, and we need to relate in all 3 dimensions. Number 3 is looking for what's unseen, not just seeing what we always see. A very straightforward thing to say, kind of simple, but very difficult or challenging to see what you're not seeing. Number 4, working with cracks, and I'll come back to that. Number 5, experimenting a way forward. So feeling your way forward, not just doing what's familiar or safe. Number 6, collaborating with unlike others, not just with people we like or who are like us. And we can talk about that more. That number 6 is, in a way, the center of my own work. And I wrote a book in 2017 that I've just spent the better part of a year revising entirely, which is called Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People You Don't Agree With or Like or Trust, which is a double click on habit 6. And habit 7, it says persevering and resting, which oddly enough, people find, I notice people find very evocative, especially people who are frantically trying to deal with what's going on in the world and at the risk of burning out or killing themselves. And so persevering and resting, not just sprinting for a short while and not just pushing on until we burn out. So that's the 7, and I can come now to number 4 and number 1, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So, some of these are things I've thought about and written about a lot, and I'm pretty good at. In a way, looking for what's unseen is the essence of the scenario method, and was the essence of the discovery in South Africa, that if you want to understand the system, you can read books and hire experts, or you can get a team of people from across the system where to understand what's going on, they literally just have to turn to their neighbor and say, what do you see from where you are? So I think I'm relatively good at number 3, and I'm actually quite good at persevering and resting, and collaborating with unlike others is in the core of my professional focus for decades. But this working with cracks, well, the 2 I'll mention, the working with cracks and acting responsibly, were ones that I really wasn't thinking about. And it turns out, well, for me, they're very interesting because they're fresh, but I also find they're evocative for people. Other people have told me they're evocative. And the idea of the working with cracks is what we alluded to a little while ago, which is that from a distance, it's easy to think that things are just the way they are, that systems are solid and stable and smooth, and the only way to transform them is to dynamite them. And so people do say, this is just not working, the food system's not working, the energy system's not working, we've just got to literally or figuratively blow it up. And I'm not saying that's never a good idea, but it's a risky idea. And we're currently living through efforts to dynamite the global trading system. And I, for one, think it's a dangerous activity, which is causing a lot of hardship in the world, and probably not the best way to do it. So the alternative to that is to say, wait a second here, actually, they're not, systems are, they were built, they can be rebuilt. They're not as stable or smooth as they might look from far away. If you get up close to them, you can see that they're fluid and they're creaking and they're cracking. And it could be they're cracking because things that don't work, or they're cracking because somebody's found a different way to do things, a bright spot. And that paying attention to and working with the cracks is a very productive way. I gave a talk the other day, and somebody said to me, this reminds me of the Robert Capa, the thing Robert Capa's famous for having said. I didn't know this. Robert Capa was a famous war photographer, I think in the 70s. I can't remember the year, but he's famous for saying that if your picture's not good, if your photograph's not good, get closer. And this idea, and so I often find people say, oh, nothing's working, it can't be fixed, it's just terrible. And I think that's partly because they're looking at it from too far away. And I love abstract thinking, so I fall into that. But this idea that no, actually, there's always things that can be done. And so anyhow, when I started to think about this, it turns out this metaphor of cracks is very rich. This idea that you're trying to get up a mountain face as a rock climber, it's all about the cracks. That's where you're going to put your feet and your toes. You don't climb a rock face, you climb the cracks in a rock face. And then Bayo Akomalefe writes very beautifully and poetically about cracks. And then, of course, as a Montrealer, I remembered that I'm obliged as a Montrealer to quote Leonard Cohen at least once in every podcast. He had this famous song where he said, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Actually, it's more interesting than I've always quoted the second two lines of the refrain. But in a way, the first two lines are even more interesting. If you'll recall, he says, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So, in this period we're living in where many people are terrified and overwhelmed and confused and paralyzed, to remember that there's bells that all of us are in touch with, bells that still can ring, but that the key or a key is to forget your perfect offering. Forget this idea that you have to have it all figured out before you can do anything. So that's the idea of cracks.
That's that's a great analogy. The mountain one is, I think, excellent because you can't see the spots where you you're supposed to put your hands and your fingers from far away. You got to be right up close. You can't even see it. Can't even see the next crack that you need to.
Right. Right. Exactly. I hadn't thought of that, but that's excellent. Yeah.
But could we maybe dive into an example, or something like what does that look like? What does a crack look like in a system?
Well, I'll just give two examples, but I think maybe, and I'm interested in what you can think of as examples. I'll give you my two. Maybe you can give me your two. Reos Partners, the organization of which I'm a co-founder, most of our work, inspired by that first experience in South Africa, involves bringing groups of people together in person for multiple days to work together on transforming the system that they're concerned about and that they're part of. When COVID hit, we couldn't do that anymore. It was impossible. But what happened, and we aren't the only ones that figured this out, but we figured it out very quickly and very successfully. We realized there's a whole other way to do this, which was on Zoom, which has drawbacks, which have become more clear over the years that followed, but also great advantages, that you could have global groups as easily as local groups. It was much less costly. People who, for whatever reason, family reasons or disability reasons, couldn't travel or couldn't go to multiple-day workshops, could participate. Language interpretation went from this very expensive thing to this actually very affordable thing. So suddenly the COVID opened up a whole new way of working, which of course is now how all of us work, at least some of the time. Now we've gone back to doing in-person things, and I think there's lots of things that can't be done online, but that's an example of we had never done that. We have been using Zoom in our own internal meetings for years, but I don't think we'd ever done a workshop, let alone a big, significant workshop online. So that's one example. A more current example is I was in South Africa again in April presenting this book, and I was in Johannesburg and talking with political people and people who think about politics and geopolitics. And as you may know, South Africa has really been hit hard in a very bizarre way by the new American administration, and in ways that are causing suffering to millions of people, including the cancellation of medical aid programs related to HIV/AIDS. So it's a crisis. And yet I was surprised at how many South Africans I met said, yes, it's terrible. It's really causing us a huge pain, but also there's an opportunity here. Forever we've wanted a world where the U.S. didn't tell everybody what to do, or the North in general didn't tell everybody what to do. Now there's an opportunity to do so. So these are two, maybe not the best examples, but two examples that come to mind. But when you think about cracks in the systems, organization, or otherwise that you are in touch with, literally, what comes to mind?
So the one that is sort of obvious, I wanted to look past, but I guess I can't, is income inequality, and as a big driver of lots of what we've experienced over the last eight plus years now. I think that's, that should be an obvious crack that we need to address through policy, through a whole range of things. We can argue about whether or not that we're actually doing anything about that, but that should be, that's linked to social unrest. It's linked to so many things that life is pretty good economically for those at the top of the economic hierarchy, but now, I think what we're seeing in lots of societies, particularly with millennials and younger generations, is that they are, they're having difficulty getting on this is, property ladder, having a life, a economic prosperity that's better than their parents. All of those things are going away. What that does, I don't know, but that is that's definitely a crack in the system, and perhaps an opportunity to redesign maybe redesign politics a little bit, and that cracks, I think, bring risk and opportunity. So if we don't recognize them, then things could go could go south fairly quickly. Sure.
Let me build on that one, because I think there's a second aspect of that excellent example, which is the cracks in the apparent economic progress and growth and prosperity. If you look closer, you'll see that some people are prospering and other people the opposite. But I think there's a second associated crack, which is a crack in the belief that that's okay and that it has to be that way, and that rising tide lifts all boats, and what's good for business is good for everybody, and the kind of capitalism we've had is the only way. So, and that crack in the apparently solid, smooth belief that this is just the way things have to be, I think that's creating. So the point about the cracks is to pay attention to them and move towards them rather than ignore them and stay away from them. That's the key idea in habit number 4.
I was also, as you were talking, thinking about policies and things like that, and that brought me to habit 5, experimenting the way forward, which I think we aren't great at doing. Political discourse in most countries is very, it's sort of absolute, and party A has, they have all the great ideas, and they'll pretend that party B doesn't, and it, rather than, let's try this, let's try that, let's see if there's something here. And that, I think, is another great habit. I think experimenting is so under considered, underrated, particularly in policy circles.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting, because I think this idea that we're not sure what will work, we have an idea, we're going to try it and see, and we're going to adjust, is in a way more readily accepted in the business world than in the political world. As I said at the beginning of the interview, my first jobs were in the corporate sector, and I remember a Shell executive saying to me once, I don't mind taking risks, I just want to understand what they are, but those of us who drill holes in the ground looking for oil are used to the idea that not everything's going to work. And yet, when I started working outside of Shell, and particularly with government people, one of the first things I heard was, the worst thing that could happen to me, a civil servant said, is that my minister would have to stand up in Parliament and defend or explain a mistake. So that's a real problem, because actually, I think, in dealing with these complex, problematic situations, it's practically impossible to know in advance what's going to work. We're just going to have to figure it out as we go. But as you said, policy and political people aren't usually very comfortable with figuring it out as we go, even though it's required.
Business people as well, I would also add, because the primacy of shareholder returns and so forth, if you don't hit your quarterly targets, then something's off, and so there's a lot of pretending going on in the world that and I'll bring, so going back to another crack, I'll add something here that I'd love to get your reactions to. But prior to my current role, I worked also in a corporate and a corporate environment from 2015 to 2023, and it was sort of one big crisis after another. So it started with, here in the UK, Brexit, then Trump, then everything to do with some of Trump's policies, then COVID, then Russia, Ukraine, and it's always one thing after another. But I also noticed that among senior leaders it's a feeling that at some point we're going to go back to normal, and the world will be more predictable, and that isn't going to That isn't going to happen. The world in which we live that is not the world in which we live. And to me, that is a bit of a crack in terms of leadership also in the corporate sector. But I think we have a crack in leadership in the corporate and the public sector.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And again, as you said, and as I say in the book, all of these cracks present risks and opportunities. Some people find them frightening or dangerous, or they are dangerous. These cracks are dangerous and frightening for some people, and they're energizing and hopeful for others. So I don't want to make this sound easy. It's not, and it's not straightforward at all. But yes, the idea that there's a stable, solid, smooth world that we can go back to, I think that's an illusion. And what is it that William Gibson said? The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I guess that's another version of the crack. If you look, it's all there already. You just have to look. I hadn't made that connection to the Gibson quote.
Would love to tie in the first habit that you mentioned, acting responsibly. Spend a bit of time on what that means.
Yeah. So I was reminded of this because you talked about accountability sinks, that there's systems or routines or rules that enable people just keep doing what they're doing. And for me, the opposite of an accountability sink is a responsibility attractor or whatever. And that chapter is interesting because it came up in the interviews. And initially I thought, well, sounds like kind of a nice way to end the book. Invoking responsibility seemed like a nice parting thought. But my 26-year-old granddaughter, who did the illustrations for the book, and is I think a thoughtful and engaged citizen, and my editor, Steve Piersante, who's a brilliant editor, both said, no, this has to be the first chapter. This is fundamental. And it's an odd chapter in that it doesn't, I think it's shorter than the others, and it doesn't tell you what acting responsibly is. I don't know for you, Ben, what acting responsibly means. I mean, it depends on who and where you are in the world. And speaking for myself, is acting responsibly as part of my company, Reos Partners? Is it as a family member? Is it as a husband? Is it as a Montrealer? Is it as a Jew? I have different roles in the world and therefore different responsibilities. So what I say in the chapter is it's a riddle, not a recipe, but it's an important riddle. And you'll recall that each of the chapters starts with one interview, and the interview that starts that chapter is with a First Nations woman in Canada, a medical doctor named Marcia Anderson, who does amazing work around health equity in Winnipeg and Manitoba. And I was talking to her about her work and why she does what she does. And she said, almost in passing, well, Adam, it's an all my relations thing. And this phrase, all my relations, I'd heard before, because if you hang out with First Nations in Canada or Native Americans in the United States, you'll sometimes hear this phrase in ceremonial invocations. People sometimes end a prayer or a statement with the words, all my relations. It's a very important phrase. So I said, well, that's interesting, Marcia. I've heard that phrase. What does it mean? And she says, well, it means that I have responsibility, not just for my immediate family, but for all my relations, including larger groups of people or all humanity or even non-human beings. So that's a challenging idea. And I was with Marcia last week because I presented this book in Winnipeg, and she kindly helped organize a talk. And then after the talk, she and I had a dialogue about exactly this. And I asked her, well, how does that work, Marcia? I mean, conceptually, I get it that we're all kin, but my experience is pretty complicated. I have lots of roles, lots of responsibilities, lots of relatives. How do I figure out what to do? And she had what I thought was a very excellent answer, obvious, but excellent answer. She said, well, it's a lot of trade-offs. And she said, let's not be romantic about First Nations beliefs in general and about all my relations in particular. It's an approach, but it immediately brings with it trade-offs and compromises. And I thought that was really helpful.
It's another great word, trade-offs. That is one we don't like to acknowledge, right? Because it means we're giving something up.
Yeah. Somebody pointed out a few months ago that in the sustainability space, which is work I've been in for a long time, the idea that everything can be win-win-win is a very problematic misunderstanding. That some things are win-win-win, but not a lot of things. And the idea that it has to be, that unless it's a win-win-win, we can't do it, well, it doesn't leave us with much to do at all. So the idea that what I'm becoming clearer on is that this idea that we're dealing with permanent differences and disagreements and trade-offs. Period.
Could I link something else that you talk about here? When we started the conversation, you talked about transforming systems peacefully, but that doesn't mean without conflict. I think you make a really important point about conflict in the book, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. Conflict is that we need, we transform conflict, and we need, conflict. We can't pretend that we're negotiating our way through this world without it, or that we I forget the exact the exact phrasing, but so when you say peacefully, presuming that means non-violently, but that doesn't mean without conflict.
Yes. So it's exactly that, and many people have written about this more eloquently than me. But yes, I'm somebody who's very conflict averse. I mean, many people are, but I'm one of them. I really makes conflicts with other people, whether it's in business or in my family. I feel very uncomfortable and have a little meltdown every time. So I'm not saying this is easy or easy for everybody. Some people are better at it than I am. But what I've come to realize, and actually is becoming clearer and clearer to me in these last months, is that the idea, let me put it this way. Working with others is difficult because there are real differences and disagreements amongst us. And if we say that the requirement for working across difference is that we have to agree on what's the problem, what's the solution, what's the plan, who's going to do what, we have to have the same values, we have to trust one another, we take a situation which is difficult and we make it absolutely impossible. So what I'm coming to realize, and I'm trying to practice in my own life, is, getting comfortable with difference and disagreement is essential. And the person who first said this to me was Juan Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia. When he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016, in the day the prize was announced, his office put out a press release and he referred to the work, a small piece of work that he and I had done 20 years before, a set of workshops actually based on the South African ones, actually recommended to Santos by Mandela himself, which had brought together various parties in the Colombian Civil War in 1996. And then 20 years later, he won the Peace Prize for having got a peace accord that ended that war, or the major part of that war. And so, of course, I was thrilled that he mentioned that, but I really couldn't figure out why did he remember that? So many bigger things that happened in the 20 years since. He had been Minister of Defense, had a huge military campaign to try to destroy the opposition. There had been 5 years of negotiations in Havana. Why did he even remember those workshops? And I was in Bogota, and I had a chance to interview him. And that was the question I asked him. Why do you keep referring to this project, which is called Destination Colombia? And he said, Adam, the reason I keep referring to this project, because he used to talk about it in speeches every month, is because this is the first time I realized that, contrary to all of my political and family and cultural upbringing, it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. And I thought this was so interesting, because so many of us believe, especially people like me, dialogue facilitators, well, we're going to get people together, they're going to have a meal, they're going to go for a walk, they'll have a drink, and they'll find, with all the terrible misunderstanding, we actually want the same thing. And sometimes that happens, but often it doesn't. And he gave a great example, which was his relationship with Hugo Chavez, who at the time was the president of Venezuela. And Chavez was a revolutionary Bolivarian socialist, and Santos was a conservative Democrat. So it was obvious that they were never going to agree. It wasn't even worth talking about. And yet they were presidents of neighboring countries, and there was stuff that they had to work out, or that they ought to work out. And they did. So this idea, and I'm thinking about a lot, because all kinds of disagreements I come across in daily life and political life and business life and family life. This idea of living with difference without always expecting or needing to fix it. And the word I've used, I don't use it in this book, I use the very final word in the new edition of Collaborating with the Enemy, is the word abide.
Okay.
And abide, if you look it up in the dictionary, means to dwell, to remain, to continue. And it's a nice word because it's not used very often. And therefore doesn't have a lot of connotations. But I think it's about, I have come to think the last few months that the essence of radical engagement is abiding, being with rather than apart from.
Okay. I haven't thought of that word in that way. And I think when I hear it used, when you hear the term, abide by something, it means following a rule or something like that. Or people mean it that way, or I maybe interpret it that way. But
I'm a very bad at English grammar, so I did have to spend a whole half a day understanding the difference between the transitive and intransitive version of abide. I think that's the transitive version, abiding a rule. But abiding, I think it's intransitive. Sorry for my botched English grammar.
I'm not able
has a different meaning, and it's defined as dwell or continue.
Right.
Be with rather than apart from. And so that's, for me, if you go beneath the habits to radical engagement, beneath radical engagement, you get abiding.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Very interesting. I think we've talked a little bit about acting responsibly. We've also gone into the collaborating with others. I really like the last, your conclusion, but beginning anywhere. And we talked a lot about income inequality, of the state of the world. These feel like really big, intractable problems, or problematic. I forget the term that was the
problematic situations.
Problematic situations. That's it. And we can feel powerless.
Yeah.
And that is, and that can, I guess it could be quite cyclical. So I really like this idea of beginning anywhere. And wondering if, I know it's not one of the 7, but I really like it. I really like the idea of just beginning.
So again, I finished the text of the book last August, and it was published this April. It takes a long time to bring a book out with all the production. And now I've been talking about the text in the current context. And actually, there's a lot of things there's some things that I understand more clearly, including the full significance of what you just mentioned. When I wrote Begin Anywhere, I was thinking of this a statement I came across by the modern musical composer John Cage, who said, "There's a temptation to do nothing simply because there's so much to do that one doesn't know where to begin. Begin anywhere." And what I was the reason I put that as the title of the conclusion is I wanted to make the simple point that there's not a recipe or a sequence to these 7 habits. Do whichever one makes sense or where you see an opportunity, and they're all connected. But as I presented the book the last 2 months, I think I'm saying more than what I said in the book.
Right.
Which is that because the context is, as you just said, many people feeling overwhelmed and frightened and paralyzed. And so I think the bigger message of Begin Anywhere is that let's lower the bar here. That we can begin anywhere. We don't have to know everything before we start doing anything. We don't have to work on everything, the whole world problematique. We don't have to all work on the same thing. We don't have to agree with others about the solution, the problem, the plan, the principles. We don't have to wait for other people to do what we want them to do. We can just begin anywhere. And the reason I think that way of saying it is resonating is because what I'm arguing is, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
Fantastic. I would love to just touch on a couple of things before we start to wrap up. Although it's a beautiful place to wrap up, but I
was trying to do a mic drop there. Then
well, you did. In fact, no, I know you did. But what I might do is include that as one of the clips, the promotional clips.
Okay.
But it's wonderful mic drop. But I just want to take advantage of having you here and
no, fine. I'm kidding you.
And just touch on a few things. I had 2 thoughts as you were talking, and one was around persevering and resting. And I wanted to link it to something else that I've been thinking about over the past week, maybe because I need to rest. But the changing role of technology is such that I kind of feels to me like, first of all, we're not resting enough, but we're not. I think there was someone who talked about, I was talking to this week, the role of not having his smartphone around and going to a job every day for 2 hours before smartphones, and then using that time to write. Whereas now, probably you wouldn't do that because you have the smartphone, and so we numb. We numb, these feelings of powerlessness, and to get to connect it to Begin Anywhere. It's too easy to numb and distract ourselves with a game, or play Wordle, or scroll social media, or do whatever that actually we're never actually. It feels like we often are in this liminal space of not beginning, not acting, but also not resting either. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. And then there's one other thing I wanted to touch on as well, but I just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think it's an important, it's a very important point, and I'm as caught up in that as everybody else. The one, and I think it's destructive in many ways. It's the opposite of engaging radically. It's engaging distractedly or not engaging at all. And so I tried to fight against that. And the only really successful strategy I have is that when I go out to dinner with Dorothy, I leave the phone in the car. Because, even having the phone in your pocket means that a part of your brain is wondering what's waiting there for you. So yes, I think I would say it another way. What makes the work I do harder than when I started is the distraction of the smartphone. People, can't find it hard to be present, even in these high stakes workshops. You almost have to take the phone away. Say, we'll get, have it back at the meals. But so no, I think it's a big deal.
And I guess lastly, the thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on, and it's something I've been thinking about for a while now, but I'm not sure there's anything here, to be honest. Is when you talk about working with cracks and experimenting and beginning, even though we may not know the answer. And to me, those are decisions, right? We make choices, and this is a podcast about decision making. And we need to, the idea I have, and I don't really know if there's, I think there's something here, but I don't know what to do with it, or if others are thinking along the same lines, is when we talk about acting responsibly, I often think about, we can only make the best decisions we can based on what we know when we decide.
Yeah.
And we need to get to a space where we're holding people more to account for that, rather than outcomes that may not have been entirely in our control. And it's one of the bases of the decision sciences. There's a lot that we know about this, but it's very, very difficult to enact. Don't know if you have any thoughts around that, because I do see that as one of the possible ways forward in all of what we're talking about. But if we are able to hold each other to account for making the right, the best decisions we can based on what we know, as opposed to outcomes which may be not entirely in our control. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, well, I don't know at all. That field and that literature better than I do. And I'll just say two things. One is that, the idea of holding people accountable for things that they can't control seems unfair and unwise. So I think that's important. I don't know what the alternative is, but I want to come back to how this relates to experimenting a way forward. And there's this phrase in China that's well known. I think it may be a folk saying or something, but the Communist Party leader Deng Xiaoping is quoted as having said that the way to enact the Chinese economic reforms that he was pushing, socialism with Chinese characteristics, I think was the term, is through, and this was the phrase, crossing the river feeling for stones. So that image that none of these things are a straight highway where we can see what's ahead of us fully, and we can control where we get to. At best, we're crossing the river feeling for stones. Maybe not in all issues, but in many issues, certainly in all of the complex and conflictual, problematic situations that at least that are the focus of my work and your work. And so I think we need accountability systems that recognize that reality rather than pretending it isn't there.
Okay. Wonderful. I'm sorry for ruining your mic drop moment. But I really wanted to. This was lovely.
It's all fun.
I really
All
enjoyed
good.
this. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
taking time to
It's
chat
a
with me.
pleasure,
Was there
Ben.
anything that
Thank
you
you.
wanted to mention before we wrap up? Of course, the book is called Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems: The Catalytic Power of Radical Engagement, which I presume is available wherever books are sold.
Yes.
But was there anything that you wanted to mention?
Piled up at the cash registers and Waterstones. Not really. But yes, no, there's nothing else I wanted to mention. But no, there's nothing I need to add. Thank you. And I wrote a lot of notes of what I learned from the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.